So this presentation is called the Fine Art of Balancing, and it's always difficult for me to follow Gabby Kalapos because Gabby is a wealth of information as well as enthusiasm on this topic. But I'll do my best to sort of try to put this in the perspective of what the Association of Municipalities does, who we are, and you know what balancing growth and environmental protection means to municipal governments writ large in Ontario. Necessarily, this is going to be a pretty, as they say, high-level presentation, not too detailed. I think you've gotten a lot of details so far, but I'll try to put some perspective around it from my point of view. So municipalities in Ontario, they're old governments. People don't think of them that way, but they have existed in Ontario and Canada, and frankly in most jurisdictions before the nation state that we think of right now. Toronto, Ottawa, may have had different names, London, but they predate Confederation, predate the province of Ontario, predate Canada in some ways. They deliver essential local services to property and people. And in Ontario, that's particularly important because the services to people make up a good deal of what municipalities do, in sort of contrast to other jurisdictions across Canada. Municipalities in Ontario have responsibility for delivering social services, affordable housing, social housing, and that's not necessarily the case in public health, by the way, and that's not necessarily the case in the rest of Canada. The powers that define municipalities are provincially set out. The Municipal Act sets out our broad spheres of influence, and how municipalities are able to do what they do, and how councils are able to make decisions and the processes that need to be followed. The Planning Act also sets out broad responsibilities for the planning process and how land gets developed. And then there are some other pieces of legislation and many regulations underneath them. I think it's around 170 different acts and growing that the province of Ontario has in place that sort of require municipal action and reporting and what have you. I would sort of say that that consumes a good bit of what municipalities do. This isn't in our slide deck here, but I want to leave you with this number. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario. They range from the city of Toronto at nearly 3 million people and the city of Ottawa at nearly 1 million people at the last census. And they go down to, a couple of hundred in some cases. 270 of those municipalities have 10,000 and fewer people, and just 35 have over 100,000. So Ontario is a pretty diverse place in terms of the municipal sector and who we cover. Municipalities play a crucial role in planning economic growth, but also planning community growth. I often go back to the principle of subsidiarity and the need for, which is an old Catholic principle, if you will, for those of you who don't know it, that specifies that the decisions that are made should be made as close to the people that are affected by them as possible. So municipalities, I think, play a fundamental role in the way we grow our economies and communities from the ground up. So I'm certainly no expert in planning, but and I think you've spoken to those who are, and there are other people on the call or on the meeting today. But we do know that there's a Planning Act in place, and it designates control for land development. The province, through requirements for municipal plans, etc., delegates to the municipality the planning process, and municipalities set the mix of residential, commercial, institutional, etc. Still developed through mandatory public engagement with our communities. Strategic plans set out long-term goals for the community, capital plans, asset management plans, which we've heard about, master servicing plans, et cetera, et cetera. There are many plans of the municipal sector, and there should be, to be fair. But it does require a lot of action for the municipal government to negotiate. And then, lately we've had municipal climate action plans and GHG targets, facilities. Generally speaking, there's a corporate plan, but those are growing into more community-based plans. And as we've heard, the way a municipality grows and plans can have a huge impact on the infrastructure required and the sorts of energy requirements just to live in the community. So that's the way municipalities deal with sort of setting the context for growth, but then municipalities invest in growth quite directly. Ontario municipalities across the province, and remember 444 municipalities, own and manage over $500 billion, that's $500 billion in infrastructure system assets. Each year, municipalities invest about $50 billion a year in local services and infrastructure, the majority of which come from the local property tax base. Infrastructure and related services, obviously, the reason we offer them is to make it easier for residents and businesses to create and offer and access more services and goods. But the other side of it is that for the longest time, and I'll get to this in a later slide, public health and environmental protection have been part of that. But just to hammer home the important role that municipalities play in economic development at the local level, for each dollar invested in infrastructure, I think it was a 2016 paper by the Broadbent Institute, and of course things fluctuate over time, but it was concluded that each dollar invested raises GDP by 1.43 dollars and returns 44 cents in taxes in the short term. Long term, that is returns $2.46 to $3.83 for each dollar spent. So there's a huge multiplier effect to infrastructure investment, and of course there's a short-term impact on jobs, which is why you hear often about the investment in infrastructure being an economic stimulus, and why sometimes governments look to it. I would also say that having stable planned investments in infrastructure that are supported by municipal governments, but also, we can't do it all alone. There's a lot of infrastructure that requires updating. The longer we're able to specify what that investment will be, and sort of invest stably, it becomes an automatic economic stabilizer as the economic cycle moves on. So I think it's fair to say municipalities play a pretty crucial role in economic growth, both in the way they plan, the way their communities develop, and the way that they invest in that development. So as I said, municipal services have long been fundamental to human health and environmental advances. We've got drinking water, waste collection, wastewater and sewage management, now stormwater. All have played a role in managing many of the diseases spreading in cities in the early 19th century and previously. A colleague of mine who spends his time on waste policy notes that waste collection first started during the bubonic plague era as a way to try and limit the spread. At first, the water management was about longer pipes to access clean water and help move the wastewater away, and then chemical treatment was added, and drinking water effluent, stormwater effluent was changed, and made the quality of those environmental services better for our communities, and made our communities able to accommodate more people longer term in larger buildings and more economic activity. I just thought this may be a bit of an aside, but as we think about moving into changing our transportation mix, and as Gabby mentioned, buildings and transportation are the two largest GHG emitters, but taking a historical view, it's important to recall that that the automobile was once thought to be a bit of an environmental answer to the crisis, the horse manure crisis, if you will. I think it's actually called that, of 1894. But the streets of London and New York were literally littered with horse waste, and a working horse apparently only had about a 3-year lifespan, and the things were pretty dire. They spread typhoid fever, etc., etc. So you can look back in various newspaper articles and see this idea that the automobile was going to be part of the answer to that, and indeed it probably has, but it's also created its own problems that we need to solve. And I only say that as not to suggest that electrification of the automobile is the wrong way to go, just that we need to be careful and thoughtful about the unintended consequences that we manage and when we advocate for things. So where are we? Municipal governments and environmental protection. More recently, municipal governments have been working with businesses and communities to manage energy intensity and climate impacts. There's been a lot of work on GHG reduction and resilience. Historically, it's focusing mostly on the corporate side of things, so expanding green fleets, transit, and active transportation. Some municipalities have used district energy systems. Green energy in certain facilities has been added and needs to probably be expanded as we upgrade those facilities. Retrofits of municipal and other buildings are desperately important, particularly our residential stock that's out there, and how to tackle that. Municipal governments are definitely working to help tackle climate change and intensification and density challenges, vehicle electrification. As I said, transit expansion. Longer term, there's deep energy retrofits for commercial and residential buildings. There's a potential to use technologies such as wind and solar, and district energy and demand management. There's a lot of legacy hydro dams out there, that could play a role in local grids if we can deal with energy storage. There's also the potential for biogas and biodigesters on waste and wastewater facilities, helping to close the loop on those on organic waste and methane emitted by them into renewable natural gas, which could help to offset some of our natural gas demands. And if we couple those with demand side management solutions and conservation and reduction, those would be helpful to our climate goals, but longer term, those are extremely expensive investments to make, and we need to have a sustainable revenue stream from them, as well as some capital put up front. Some municipalities are doing it now, some have done it in the past, but to really make a dent in our demand, we'll need to have more funding, generally speaking. Sorry, that's not what you want to see. This is a new computer and still working through some of its challenges. So climate adaptation and resilience. So municipalities play a huge role in climate adaptation and resilience, which I also refer to as economic and social continuity in the face of these events. So Flooding is probably the major one in the Ontario context and Canadian context. And certainly, there have been many headlines around the economic cost in BC and Ontario and other places lately. But we also manage extreme heat and cold through our public health folks, and some of the resilience that we do that does have impacts on roads and other infrastructure. Municipalities play a huge role in disaster management, forestry, fires, and sometimes they have to accommodate folks from other areas, and when communities are evacuated. So I would also just sort of pause there and say the pandemic has made all of this really, really more challenging for municipalities, not just accommodating displaced people in these emergencies, but also, how to manage staff and health requirements and social distancing, and making sure that these essential services such as water and wastewater and what have you operate at the same time. We know that flooding is a major climate need. AMO's put out a response paper to the Ontario government's flooding strategy. There are a lot of different needs in Ontario at the municipal level for dealing with flooding. The most major one being infrastructure, to try and mitigate flooding, including green infrastructure, which we had a great presentation on earlier. And municipalities are working really hard to include green infrastructure in what they do. The IBC, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, says that flooding cost $2.4 billion in 2020 and $2.1 billion in 2021 in terms of insurance claims. That's an awful lot of money that could go to other uses. Changing weather and changes floodplains, erodes shorelines, brings water closer to residences, and changes sort of the historical basis on which our planning was done. And there needs to be a lot of work done to understand how those floodplains will change and deal with flood mapping. Some of that work is underway, and will be really helpful to municipalities in understanding how to mitigate flooding and better protect their residents longer term. I just wanted to give out a shout out here. I talked about green infrastructure, but there's also low impact development on properties that allow sort of better recharge and retention of water, permeable pavements, green roofs, et cetera, that can probably help if we were to deploy it in a more systematic way. It could probably really help our communities to develop in a better way and help to deal with flooding and probably make our communities much more palatable and accessible for people as well. So what about AMO and what have we done? So AMO is an association of municipal councils. We are political but nonpartisan. We work for our members, which are the vast majority of governments in Ontario, municipal governments in Ontario, and we support municipal council needs in federal and provincial policy, primarily by doing government relations and advocacy and policy analysis and working with our federal government and provincial governments and other stakeholder partners. We also offer shared services for members to try to make them more affordable. Recognizing that more affordable services means that there are tax dollars that can be reinvested in other services. One of AMO's board's strategic objectives for the last few years has been to address the environmental, economic, and social impacts of climate change through integrated solutions. We have put out a climate change paper series that's tried to repackage and re-examine our policy solutions in a number of areas in a more integrated kind of way to provide a macro municipal lens on climate change, generally speaking. And you're welcome to go to our website. They're all available there, as well as a lot of other tools. And then there's a lot of work that we do in terms of commenting on regulations and legislation, and just being involved in the public conversation around the rules that we need and the inputs that we need and investments to make our communities better. We've got a longer term goal of integrating these impacts, and I think you will start to see, if you haven't already, how we start to think about social and equity from an environmental and economic point of view as well. So in summary, if we have time for questions, and again, I'm just giving you the high level, and I'm happy to get down into the questions a little bit more. Municipalities manage and have always managed growth and environmental protection, and it's increasingly holistic in the way that they do that. Protecting the environment and public health has always been central. As systems get more sophisticated and the level of management more minute, such as wastewater effluent standards and others, there's more intensive requirements. And this is where I would go back to my point about 270 municipalities in Ontario having fewer than 10,000 population. Some of those are much smaller, and that means that the number of staff available and the amount of resources for those staff are less than you would think. So staff capacity is a huge challenge, particularly as you think of all those pieces of legislation and plans and requirements such as asset management and green energy and what have you. They are stretching staff capacity in ways that are unimaginable, even before you get to the point of having to invest in services. So I think that'll be it. Maybe I see Steph coming on, so I'm worried that I'm running out of time, but maybe I'll just leave you with funding and financial instruments to manage GHGs is really going to be needed in the long term, and we're going to need the provincial and federal government's help to help local property taxpayers